Spider-Man will always be a huge part of my childhood. Being born in the early 2000s meant I was able to experience both Sam Raimi's and Marc Webb's Spider-Man films without having a nostalgia-based bias. I remember watching all three of Sam Raimi's films when I was really young. I somehow even remember being really hyped for the third one back when I saw its trailer in 2006. But the Amazing Spider-Man duology also made a huge impact on my childhood. I was 10 when the first of those films came out, and I enjoyed it quite a bit, but when you're a kid you don't really tend to pay attention to specific plot and visual details as much as when you're an adult. And since today marks the 10th anniversary of The Amazing Spider-Man's release, I went ahead and rewatched it along with its sequel. When I saw it again, I noticed that I was enjoying the movie way more than I did when I was a kid. I paid more attention to the various aspects of the film, such as the characters and story, and each of them was executed quite well, and I'll be talking about each of those aspects in this video. The day is March 12th, 2009. Sony Pictures had just announced the release date for Spider-Man 4, May 6th, 2011. Despite the mixed to negative reception of Spider-Man 3, Sony and Columbia Pictures were convinced to make a fourth film because it did pretty well at the box office. Sam Raimi was directing again, Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst were coming back to play their respective roles, and there was rumors that Dylan Baker's Dr. Connors would become the Lizard, John Malkovich would play the Vulture, and Anne Hathaway would be playing Black Cat. We also had rumors that there would be Spider-Man 5 and 6 after the fourth one, but I'm not sure those were ever confirmed to be true. In October of 2008, Sony hired James Vanderbilt to write the film's script, and it went through several rewrites for about a year. Raimi had reportedly gone through 4 revisions of the script, and he hated each one. The film was delayed and eventually cancelled in January of 2010. Tobey Maguire himself was even interviewed about it only about a week before it was cancelled. Sony decided that they wanted to reboot the franchise with a new cast, and the reactions to that were mixed. Some liked the idea because they thought Spider-Man 3 was just that bad, and the franchise wouldn't be able to recover if they hadn't rebooted it, and others thought it was a good idea because the actors were getting a bit too old to play their characters. But many were also angry at Sony for that decision. They didn't want to see the origin story of Spider-Man again when it hadn't even been a decade since we last saw it on the big screen. Sony had said they wanted to make a darker and more serious origin story inspired by The Dark Knight for Peter Parker, who would be played by Andrew Garfield, and again, the reactions were mixed. Some liked the idea that Spider-Man would be getting a Dark Knight-like treatment, while others thought those kinds of movies were getting repetitive and that Sony was just rebooting the series for money. Fast forward to February of 2011, where we got a glimpse of what Spider-Man's suit would look like in the new reboot, as well as an official name for the film, The Amazing Spider-Man. A few months later, Sony released the first trailer, and about a year after that, the film was released. It came back to mostly positive reception, with it initially getting a 7.7 out of 10 on IMDb, which made it the highest rated Spider-Man film at the time. The first Spider-Man had a 7.4, the second had a 7.5, and the third had a 6.3. So most audiences at the time liked it, but since then, many people have come to hate it, and it currently stands at a 6.9 out of 10. I think the poor reception for the second movie is one of the reasons that's the case. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 tried too hard and too short of a time to start a cinematic universe. The executives at Sony saw the success of the MCU and thought they could do the same with Spider-Man, so they crammed as much as they could into the second film, and that ultimately ended up being the reason it didn't do so well. I personally liked the film, but even I'll admit that it had too much packed into it. Though I also liked the ice cream flavor it got at Baskin-Robbins. They should really bring that back. Anyway, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was met with similar reactions to Spider-Man 3, with them being mixed. On IMDb, it initially had a 7.6, but it has since decreased to a 6.6 since then, and the Rotten Tomatoes score was a 66% from critics, but like the IMDb score, it has since decreased to 51%. But despite that, a third film was in the works. Until Andrew Garfield called in sick to a gala where the third movie would have been announced. Sony fired Andrew and canceled the film as a result. Another contributing factor to its cancellation was the plan to add Spider-Man to the MCU. Not long after The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released, Amy Pascal, the co-chairperson of Sony Pictures Entertainment, asked Kevin Feige, the president of Marvel Studios, for ideas for the third Amazing Spider-Man film. But instead of giving Pascal ideas for that, he instead brought up the idea of bringing Spider-Man into the MCU, to which Pascal responded by throwing a sandwich at him. In the end, however, they signed a contract to include Spider-Man in 6 Marvel Studios films. And just like that, the Amazing Spider-Man films were done for. And it seemed people were happy that was the case. By the time Captain America Civil War came out, people had really come to hate the Amazing Spider-Man films. Even nowadays, when people have admitted that Andrew was a good Spider-Man, they still say the script he was given was bad. They see the good in Andrew and the other actors, but not much more than that. So, the legacy of the Amazing Spider-Man films is that the first one was average and the second one was awful, and when the series was cancelled, people thought it was a good riddance. And again, even nowadays, people have warmed up to certain parts of the films, but they still consider them to be immensely flawed. I don't personally share that point of view. I think both of these films are incredibly underrated, and the first one doesn't get enough credit for what it does right, which is a lot. And speaking of which, let's get on to those aspects and why they were executed so well. We might as well start off with the most important aspect, the protagonist, Peter Parker, aka Spider-Man. The main reason I think people dislike this interpretation of Peter is because of one thing: difference. Unlike Tobey Maguire's or Tom Holland's Spider-Man, this version of Peter isn't the nerdy loser that everyone seemed to bully or make fun of. He's an edgy loner who passes his time by doing things like skateboarding, which made people think he was too cool to be Peter Parker. I disagree with these people, of course. Yes, he may enjoy skateboarding and all that, but he's anything but cool. He's awkward, a bit creepy, and doesn't have any friends until Gwen notices him. He even gets the shit beaten out of him by Flash and has the film in his camera ruined. So yeah, he's not really cool at all. That being said, he still shares several characteristics with Tobey and Tom's Spider-Man. He's an incredibly awkward genius, as mentioned earlier, he aspires to be a photographer, and he has a crush on a girl who's supposedly way too good for him. So no, I don't think Andrew's portrayal of Peter is too cool or different from how the character usually is. The second reason why I think people tend not to like this version of Peter is that when he gets his powers, instead of using them for good or to impress a girl, he just wanted to get revenge. He only used his powers for himself. It took several different experiences for him to realize that what he was doing wasn't right. It took time for him to go from a self-interested vigilante to a selfless hero. And I think that aspect of Peter is pretty realistic. Think about it. If you were a teenager who was abandoned by your parents, cared about by barely anyone, and you didn't have much to look forward to in life aside from a hobby of photography or a crush on a girl who doesn't even know you that well, wouldn't you be more likely to lash out at the people who wronged you? Your life isn't very great as it is, so when something as terrible as getting the shit beaten out of you or your father figure being murdered happens, you definitely want to get revenge. Peter's character was handled very realistically in this film, and I like that a lot. Another reason I think people dislike Andrew's interpretation of Peter, or this movie in general, is because it was a reboot of the franchise. People, myself included, were really hyped when we saw the announcement for Sam Raimi's fourth Spider-Man movie, especially when Raimi himself said he would try to make it the best film in the series. There were such high hopes for the movie, and when we learned about the film's cancellation, it was pretty upsetting. But I still don't see that as a reason to hate The Amazing Spider-Man. Just because a film series you liked gets cancelled and rebooted doesn't mean the reboot will be bad. And in the case of The Amazing Spider-Man, it was just trying to be a new take on the franchise and the character of Spider-Man, for the most part at least. And well, I liked it quite a lot. I like this interpretation of Peter Parker a lot too. I'd say it's my favorite actually. His character growth is one of the main reasons I like it so much. As mentioned before, he isn't a hero when we first meet him, and even after he gets his powers, he uses them for himself. It's not until his uncle dies that we start to see major character development. And after several other key moments, he develops even more. That's one of the main reasons he's my favorite portrayal of the character. He's the most realistic one we've had so far. Aside from Peter, several other characters were executed brilliantly. Gwen, I'd say, is one of the best examples. Unlike the previous romantic interest in the Spider-Man films, Gwen is intelligent, reliable, and not in trouble every few seconds. One of the biggest problems I have with the Sam Raimi films is Mary Jane. She's a huge bitch who screams a lot and gets in danger several times in each film. She straight up leaves John Jameson, who is a completely genuine and nice guy, at the altar because she decided at the last minute that she does want to be with Peter after all. She doesn't even have the decency to tell Jameson herself that she was no longer interested. Gwen, on the other hand, is the complete opposite. The minute she and Peter became a thing, both of them stayed loyal to each other, and even when they broke up, neither of them tried to look for someone else, and they eventually realized that being together would be better for both of them. She and Peter actually seem like a real high school couple. The way they act around each other is how you'd expect two teenagers who liked each other would act. Gwen shows that she's fairly intelligent and reliable too. She's clearly smart enough to get a job at Oscorp, and when the Lizard was heading over to Oscorp to execute his plan, Gwen disobeyed Peter's instructions to leave so she could finish making the antidote. And when she was attacked by the Lizard, instead of waiting for Spider-Man to save her, she tried to scare the Lizard off by attempting to burn him. And even though it failed, she at least showed she wasn't useless or reliant on Peter. To add to that, she helps Peter out multiple times throughout the film, like patching him up when the Lizard injured him. Overall, she's a much better character than Mary Jane was. Even a large portion of Raimi trilogy fans have admitted that. The next character I think was portrayed really well was Dr. Curt Connors, aka the Lizard. We first meet him at Oscorp after Peter learned that he used to work with his father. Peter pretended to be a part of a group that was touring the Oscorp building, and he met Dr. Connors through it. and the two connected almost immediately. Peter had a clear understanding of cross-species genetics, and that piqued Dr. Connor's interest. Later on, when Peter learns about a decay rate algorithm his father made, he stops by Dr. Connor's house and tells him about it, which restored his hope of getting his arm back. If cross-species genetics really was possible, this would be one of the greatest advancements humanity has made. After obtaining the algorithm, he and Peter work on a serum with lizard DNA that they would test on mice, and even though many of the theoretical tests fail, the final one they do is a success. When Rajit Ratha is informed about this, he tells Connors that he wanted to start human trials immediately, to which Connors declines, saying it was too early on. Ratha fired him and told him that the serum would be tested on a veterans hospital, under the guise that it was a flu shot. Connors couldn't let that happen, so he took matters into his own hands and tested it on himself, so those people wouldn't be in danger. He wanted to help people so much that he was willing to put his own life on the line to test the serum. It didn't matter that he was being fired. He needed to do this for the sake of humanity, and for himself too. The serum grew back his arm, but it quickly turned him into the lizard, and he began chasing Ratha to make sure the serum wouldn't get to the hospital. After attacking Ratha and fighting Spider-Man, he fled to the sewer, where he turned back into Dr. Connors. But unfortunately, he wasn't the same man he was before. The serum had driven him crazy. He was beginning to think that the lizard could become a new, more evolved version of humanity, and he wanted everyone to be a part of it. He thought he could cure all of humanity's problems by giving them that serum. So no, Connors isn't just some generic villain who's evil for the hell of it. He's a good man who was corrupted by a drug he made that he thought would be beneficial. And again, that plays into how realistic this movie is, at least when it comes to the characters. I know for a fact that lizard men aren't real, well, except for the government, they're all lizards. But character-wise, what makes them take certain actions and what makes them the person they are, that is what I consider realistic about this film. You can see why these characters have the personalities they do and why they make certain choices. Connors really did think that what he was doing was for the greater good. He thought that by turning people into those lizard-human hybrids, it'd get rid of a huge portion of their problems and make them a superior species. If it worked for him, it would surely work with many others too, right? That's the mindset he had. His obsession with his arm and improving the lives of others, as well as the serum that grew back his arm, made him go kinda cuckoo. He wanted to improve people's lives so much that he didn't realize that what he was doing was completely insane and way out of line. I really like those types of villains, ones that actually have a viable reason for their actions, and I'd say Curt Connors is one of those villains. Captain Stacy is the final character I'll talk about for an extended amount of time. Even though he isn't focused on as much as Dr. Connors or his daughter Gwen, he still manages to develop as a character, and at the same time, help Peter develop as a character too. When we first meet him, he thinks Spider-Man is an amateur vigilante who should be arrested. He even issues a warrant for Spider-Man's arrest. But when he finds out that Peter is Spider-Man, he begins to question if he was wrong all along. Eventually, he follows Peter to Oscorp and helps him take down the lizard, but is mortally wounded in the process. While dying, he tells Peter that he was wrong and that the city did need him. That's clear character development, but it's not one-sided either. They both seem to change each other for the better. Peter starts out thinking that his vigilantism was a public service until Captain Stacy gave him a reality check. He wasn't a hero or a good Samaritan. He was just taking out criminals who all looked similar because he had a personal vendetta. That talk heavily influenced Peter to abandon the search for his uncle's killer and become a hero. Several other characters were executed well too, but they didn't make as big of an impact as the three aforementioned characters, so I'll only mention them briefly. Uncle Ben was a pretty down-to-earth guy, and you could really see how much of a father figure he was to Peter, despite how angry Peter got at times. This Aunt May, unlike her MCU counterpart, seemed like an actual character with issues, as opposed to a plot device. For the first two MCU Spider-Man films, Aunt May was just mostly there to attract Tony and Happy, as well as help Peter with minor tasks, like driving him to Liz's house or teaching him how to dance with a girl. But the version of Aunt May in The Amazing Spider-Man actually seems like a person who has to deal with regular day problems. Instead of shrugging off the fact that Peter always comes home late and acts suspicious, she questions him, and so does Uncle Ben. Uncle Ben's death really affected her too, and you can see the impact it made. She's incredibly depressed after his death, and she even tells Peter that she can't sleep due to it, and her worries for Peter's safety certainly didn't help either. She had to deal with so much, and you really feel sorry for her. Flash was surprisingly good as well. When we first meet him, he seems like his typical self, a bully who picks on students who he thinks are under him. But as soon as Peter humiliates him in basketball, he gets his comeuppance. Peter did to him what he always did to others, and that made him change. After Uncle Ben was killed, he approached Peter to comfort him, and although Peter took it the wrong way, it still shows Flash grew as a person. At the end of the movie, we even see him and Peter getting along. Well, that's about all I have to say for the characters. Let's move on to the next aspect of the film I really liked. What can I say about the acting? It's fucking great! Especially on Andrew Garfield's end. He's really talented. The way he delivers his lines is just stunning.
How dare I? How dare you?
You can see the emotion he's carrying out. I know a lot of actors can portray their characters' emotions, but it's never usually on the level that Andrew could. And I'll say it, he's a much better crier than Toby. While Toby is in no way awful at crying, he definitely isn't as convincing as Andrew. Let's compare the scenes where Uncle Ben dies. You see what I mean? Andrew's crying seems more natural than Toby's. But again, I'm not saying Toby's a bad actor. He's anything but that. He was great in Brothers and The Great Gatsby, and he was in no way a bad Peter Parker either. In fact, he was a really good interpretation of the character. But in my opinion, I just think Andrew did it better. In addition to the emotion Andrew performed, both he and Emma Stone worked together so well. You could really see these two as an actual high school couple and that they actually liked each other. That was probably due to the fact the two actors were dating at the time, so it made it easier to show the way they felt about each other. Everyone else in the film did a fantastic job too. Rhys Ifans did a magnificent job at showing us the decline from a man who genuinely wanted to help people to a crazy man who wanted everyone to be part of his superior new species. Dennis Leary splendidly portrayed the grumpiness and sarcasm of a police captain, and Martin Sheen and Sally Field wonderfully played the roles of Peter's caring and worried guardians. Again, the actors did an amazing job of what they were given. And speaking of that, I've seen people say that the acting and characters are good, but the plot isn't. Once again, I'd heavily disagree with these people. The story is just as good as those other parts of the movie. I'll provide a summary of the story and give my thoughts about the central plot points. The film starts out with an opening scene that showed Peter's parents leaving him with his aunt and uncle. Many people have said that this scene is unnecessary, and so was the inclusion of Richard and Mary Parker, but I wouldn't say that's the case. Even though they were only in the movie's intro, I think that scene was a good way of showing us why Peter feels so lonely in the present day. He was abandoned by his parents when he was only 4 and without any sort of explanation. That's not some minor inconvenience. If it happened to you, I'm sure you'd be pretty damn depressed and edgy too. Anyway, after this scene, we move to the present, where Peter's in high school, and we get to see how his life has been there. It isn't the greatest. He doesn't have any friends, he's incredibly awkward, and he has a thing for the popular girl who he has no chance with. But as soon as he stands up for another student who is being bullied by Flash, Gwen starts to notice him and tells him that she thought that what he did was great. The two of them start to bond more, and they shortly become good friends. I think this sort of thing, with Peter liking a popular girl who eventually notices him, was done pretty well in all 3 portrayals of the character. Later on, Peter finds a bag that belonged to his father, and he begins investigating the contents. He finds Dr. Connors in Oscorp through that, who he visits in hopes to find answers to what happened to his parents. While he's there, he's bitten by a spider which gives him his powers, but he wasn't able to find what he was looking for there, so he went home. On the way back, his powers kick in, and he ends up having to fight several people because he mistakenly tore a girl's shirt off. He takes them all out, but it was unintentional and purely instinct, and while I think it was unnecessary to tear the girl's shirt, at least in the plot, the way Peter fought all those guys is well choreographed and ended up making the scene pretty funny. He wakes up the next day with little control over his powers and messes his room up. He then visits Dr. Connors and gives him the algorithm he found in his father's bag. Connors is astounded by it and decides to show him more of his lab at Oscorp, and the two of them make the serum that they would later inject into Fred the three-legged mouse. Peter went home afterward and was confronted by Uncle Ben since he was supposed to pick up his aunt, but he forgot to do so. Uncle Ben gives him the responsibility speech, which basically said, with great power comes great responsibility, but without using those exact words, probably to make this version seem more unique. Peter angrily stormed out of the house and went to buy some chocolate milk from a convenience store, but he was 2 cents short, so he tried to take a penny, but the clerk told him he couldn't unless he spent $10, saying it was store policy. Peter, who thought that a 2-cent difference wasn't that big of an issue, tried to negotiate, but the clerk kept turning him down, telling him to step aside and that he was holding up the line. The man behind him in line steals some money out of the cash register, throws Peter the chocolate milk, then leaves the store. The clerk ran after the guy, but he was already too far gone. He asked Peter to help, but Peter told him that it wasn't his policy. The guy who stole the money tripped when he ran into someone, which made him drop his gun, and when Uncle Ben saw it, he tried to fight for it, but he ended up getting shot. Peter heard the gunshots and came over, appalled by what he saw. His uncle had just been murdered. When the police came by his house, he was given a wanted poster of the suspect, and it was the man from the convenience store, When Peter realized who it was, he made a costume to disguise himself, as well as some web shooters, and searched for him so he could get revenge on him. He kept tabs on different suspects who shared a similar description with the man who killed his uncle, and whenever he found one, he cornered them, checked to see if he was the murderer, and webbed them up for the cops to take care of them. People began to take notice of this new vigilante Peter made himself into, and when he got popular enough, he made a higher quality suit that was more iconic looking than the last one. At this moment, he thinks he's doing a public service, things that the police can't do as easily, or to quote Peter himself,
80% of your job.
But once he meets Captain Stacy and saves that boy on the bridge, he realizes he wasn't doing that at all. He was just beating up criminals for his own benefit. That's what pushes him to go down the hero's path. Dr. Connors figures out Peter was Spider-Man and attacks him at school, but Peter manages to fight him off and locate where he had been hiding all that time, in the sewers, and he also finds out what Dr. Connors' plan was, to launch a drug into the sky that would turn all of New York into lizard people. Peter realizes that if he hadn't given Connors the algorithm, none of this would be happening, so he vows to stop him. Notice the recurring theme of guilt for taking wrongful actions? Finding out Peter could have stopped Uncle Ben's killer must have made him feel horrible. When he found out that he was the reason Dr. Connors turned into a crazy maniac, he felt immense regret and guilt for his actions. But in this case, the damage hadn't been done yet, so Peter felt that it was his responsibility to stop Dr. Connors, for he was the reason Connors had become the lizard. As Peter heads to Oscorp Tower, the police shoot him down, and Captain Stacy unmasks him. But when Peter tells him what Connors was planning, he lets him go. But before he could get away, one of the other officers shot him in the leg, which slowed him down. But even with his injury, he arrived at Oscorp in time to stop the lizard from launching the drug into the air. Captain Stacy even joins up with him, but as I said earlier, he gets mortally wounded in the process. The cure for the drug gets launched instead of the drug, and everyone who had previously been drugged by the lizard turned back to normal, including the lizard himself. Dr. Connors was his normal self again. You can tell that from how he went out of his way to save Peter when he was about to fall off the building, and even told him to check up on Captain Stacy. That gave Peter enough time to talk to him before he died. Captain Stacy told him that the city did need Peter, but he wanted Peter to promise that he'd stay away from Gwen. Peter promised, and Captain Stacy took his last breath. A funeral is held several days later, and Peter is absent from it because, again, he promised Captain Stacy he'd stay away from Gwen. But she goes to his house anyway and asks him why she hadn't seen him lately, or at the very least, at the funeral. Peter told her that he couldn't see her anymore, and she suspected that her father made him promise that. Aunt May took notice of their conversation and asked Peter if he asked her out. Peter said that he didn't because he thought he wasn't good for her, which May says isn't true. Those are the exact words Peter needed to hear. Even though that might seem like a plot device-y moment, it was both written and performed in a way that still adds more to May's character. She's willing to give anyone a piece of her mind if they say Peter isn't a good person. And again, that's one of the reasons I like this movie so much. The characters don't seem exclusively like objects that serve a purpose, they seem like actual people you would encounter in real life. And I'm sorry to say this, but those types of characters aren't as frequent in the Sam Raimi movies, and there are barely any of those in the John Watts movies. The characters in those films seem to be more exaggerated than realistic, which isn't bad, since those movies try to be more comedic than serious, but at the same time, you don't really relate to them as much, and that's just something I preferred about The Amazing Spider-Man. They're realistic and well-written characters. And at this point, I'm tired of saying realistic, but that's just what they are. When Peter goes back to school, he's tardy to class, and he promises his teacher, Miss Ritter, that it wouldn't happen again, to which Miss Ritter responds,
"Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Parker."
Peter whispers to Gwen,
"Yeah, but those are the best kind."
as a response. This scene was pretty nice to watch when the movie first came out, but after watching the second, it just makes you feel sad for what's to come. And I think that it was done on purpose. Knowing the future can hurt, so sometimes it's better to live in the moment and appreciate it. Some people criticize this scene for having Peter break his promise to Captain Stacy, and I completely understand that. But remember, Peter's just a teenager. He acts off of his own impulses. He cared too much about Gwen. Even though he'd be putting her in danger by being with her, he didn't want her to be miserable. So he chose to get back together with her. The film ends with a web swinging scene, because you know, every single Spider-Man film has to end that way. But I won't lie, this one's pretty damn awesome. That's about it for the plot. Even though the movie is more serious-toned, it's not completely devoid of humor. For starters, the quips Peter makes are some of the funniest I've seen in the Spider-Man films. He doesn't just make a bunch of pop culture references like Tom's Peter. Instead of relying on previously made pieces of entertainment for humor, the writers decided to do their own thing. The humorous moments like Peter stealing Rodrigo Guevara's ID card and when he threw Gwen out the window are pretty damn funny.
I'm gonna throw you out the window now.
The same goes for a lot of the scenes with Uncle Ben. He's a pretty humorous guy.
Something is very wrong.
Yeah. Nobody likes your meatloaf.
But anyhow, I'd say the humor in this film is almost as good, if not just as good, as the humor in Toby's films. A movie has to nail many different aspects to be good. The soundtrack is one of the most important. Without a good soundtrack, it'll be harder to get the audience to feel the emotions you want them to. But luckily, this movie does not lack a great soundtrack. It was composed by the late James Horner, who was also the producer for the scores of Avatar, Titanic, Jumanji, Apollo 13, and many other films. One of my favorite types of soundtracks is the type that uses a specific motif in its different songs, especially when they're able to set different moods with that motif. An example of this kind of soundtrack is the Undertale one. In various songs, you can hear this melody. And The Amazing Spider-Man does a similar thing with this melody. As someone who's made music, I know that the instrument choice, the tempo, and the notes you use are all vital when trying to set a mood in a song. When it's used in track 1, main title, Young Peter, it has a mysterious but optimistic vibe. And in track 17, Saving New York, the vibe you get from the song is suspenseful but hopeful. At the time this song plays, Peter has to swing to Oscorp, and with the help of the construction workers, he was able to swing across New York. The situation is dire, but he's giving chase and getting closer to reaching his goal. When you repeat motifs like this, it makes your soundtrack more iconic and recognizable than a soundtrack composed of completely unique songs. This movie's soundtrack is so good at carrying out the emotion and vibes the scenes are trying to give, and it's all beautifully composed. My hat's off to you, James Horner. You were a great composer. Until I took a film noir class, I didn't really pay much attention to the visual aspects of movies. But now I think those aspects are essential to film. When you make a movie, you don't only want to have a good story or characters, you need to make it visually appealing, otherwise people aren't going to watch it or enjoy it as much. Well, I'm happy to say this movie doesn't even come close to failing when it comes to the visual aspects. The lighting and special effects more specifically. I've always really liked how big cities light up at night. The contrast between the light and dark is vast, and I find that tremendously appealing on a visual level. And since many of the scenes in this movie take place at night, we get to see a lot of scenes with New York City lit up. I think one of the most beautiful scenes is where the cure for the lizard's drug is launched into the sky. A bright blue cloud forms above the city, and blue flakes fall to the ground like snow. The scene with the room full of spiders is another well-lit scene. The way the machines rotate is very elegant and wondrous, and the music in the scene helps put that across. And the red and blue lighting is not only pleasing to the eye, but it serves as an explanation for why Peter chose red and blue for the colors of his costume. Another scene I think is aesthetically pleasing is the one where Dr. Connors looks at his arm's reflection in the glass, like his other arm was still there. It shows how much he really wants his arm back, and that testing the serum on himself will be worth the risk. His missing arm was something he desperately wanted back, and he looked genuinely happy when he saw the reflection, even though it wasn't real. The opportunity to get it back was not something he'd want to let pass, since he was getting fired and would likely never get the chance to do it again. I think that shot was a wonderful way of showing that. The way the lizard drug glows a bright green is also really neat. And aside from the lighting, the film isn't very saturated, and that adds to the overall edgy and dark tone that the movie was trying to portray. And some people may not like that, but I personally do. When a movie is less saturated, I find it more realistic. But summarily, what I'm trying to say is that the visuals in this film are very pleasing to look at, and they can sometimes even help with the storytelling. When the suit was first shown, people had mixed thoughts about it. Some people didn't like it, saying that the sunglasses for eyes were a bad addition and that the suit had too much blue. Others didn't like the Kevlar that made the suit look like it was made out of snakeskin. Some still liked it though, and once the suit was shown in action, more people ended up liking it. I'll admit, it doesn't look fantastic during the day, but at night it looks pretty damn nice. Once again, you have to take lighting into account. It looks better in a darker environment than it does in a highly lit environment. But since most of the scenes featuring Spider-Man take place at night, that's perfectly acceptable. One thing all the Spider-Man movies have done right is the action, and this one is no exception. As stated earlier, the first action scene in the film, where Peter inadvertently uses his powers in the subway, is really well choreographed and shows how well Peter's spider sense works. The fight scenes with Lizard are pretty great as well. It isn't just two guys beating each other up, even though that alone is already pretty cool. The lizard and Spider-Man are both really intelligent, and they use their surroundings to their advantage, like the liquids lizard mix to make an exploding chemical, or Spider-Man using the closed space of the hallways to easily web up the lizard. In the school fight scene, we even get one of the best Stan Lee cameos, with him listening to music while doing his job without noticing the mayhem ensuing behind him. The final fight with the lizard has its moments too. I thought Spider-Man and Captain Stacy's team up against the lizard was awesome to watch. And again, the characters were using their environment to their advantage. Captain Stacy and Peter used the liquid nitrogen to freeze parts of the lizard, which made him more brittle and easier to shoot. But the fighting isn't the only action that's really good. The scene where Peter runs and jumps around in the abandoned workshop was another good action scene. I know people generally don't like it because it shows him being cool, but I think it's just showing you why he was so good at stunts and parkour, as well as what gives him the idea of web swinging. He doesn't start out very good at what he does, as shown by how much he fails and trips, but over time he gets better. Not only is it a well-made training montage, but it further proves that Peter isn't some perfect person who does amazingly on the first try. He needs to practice to get good at what he does. Oh, and speaking of web swinging, I think that aspect alone deserves its own section of the video. Even some of the most hateful people towards the Andrew Garfield films have admitted that the web swinging is some of the best, if not the best, in all of the Spider-Man films. Unlike the Tobey Maguire films, Spider-Man can't just swing from anywhere. If you look at the scenes with Tobey's Spider-Man swinging, you might notice a lot of the time that he's swinging from nothing. Based on the direction the web is going, it doesn't look like it's attached to anything. In The Amazing Spider-Man, however, you can either see where Spider-Man swings from, or that he's at least swinging from a possible spot, since he's usually close to a building or tall object when he swings. The film also has a couple of first-person web swinging scenes that give the viewers Spider-Man's point of view for a moment, so they can feel what it's like to be him. It's pretty immersive. What additionally makes the web swinging in this film so good is how elegant it looks. Instead of just swinging across town like Tobey tended to do, he did stunts and poses while swinging, and that made the web swing much more exciting and fun to watch. Over the course of this video, I've mentioned multiple scenes that I really liked and would talk more in depth about at a later point. There are a few other scenes I didn't mention but would like to talk thoroughly about as well. The scenes following the one where Peter gets bitten by the spider are pretty comedic, but not on a level that takes away from the overall serious tone of the film. After that scene on the subway, the spider bite was starting to affect him more. At first it enhanced his ability to sense his surroundings. When he got home, it messed with his metabolism, so he raided the fridge. When he woke up the next day, he was much stronger than he was before. He broke his alarm clock, spreaded toothpaste all over the mirror, pulled the faucet off of the sink, and broke the doorknob on one of the doors. He had to gently open the other door so the knob wouldn't break off. I like these scenes because they show how Peter's not used to his newly obtained powers and enhanced senses. The scene where Peter makes his suit and web shooters is one I also really like. In it, we actually get to see Peter's intelligence in action. He uses components of different devices, like a watch, to make his web shooters. They don't work on the first try, so Peter had to make adjustments to them multiple times. It's trial and error, another realistic thing that he had to go through. As for the suit, the way it was designed is how you'd expect a teenager to design it. It's darker, not very saturated, and made of stylish looking materials. The eyes made from sunglasses is definitely something a teenager would think of too. At the time, he thought everyone except criminals liked him and that he should be appreciated for taking criminals off the streets. But Captain Stacy told him otherwise. He thought Spider-Man was an anarchist with a personal vendetta and that he should be arrested. That talk began to push Peter in the right direction. The scene on the bridge is another pivotal moment for him. After fighting the lizard for a bit, he had to make a choice: chase down the lizard or save a kid who was stuck in a car hanging from the edge of the bridge. He does the latter, rushing over to the car, and when the kid, Jack, panics when he sees Spider-Man, Peter takes off his mask, showing him that he isn't some monster who hides his face, but just a guy who wants to help out. He gives clear instructions to Jack but remains calm so he doesn't scare him. I can't show the full scene due to copyright, but I'll provide a link to it in the description. Peter almost fails to save Jack, but he grabs him with a web at the last moment. When he saw the reaction of Jack's father reuniting with him, he contemplated what his role as Spider-Man should be, and he eventually concluded that he should let go of his vendetta and start helping people. I think one of my favorite scenes in the film, and probably in all of the Spider-Man films, is the crane scene. After getting shot by an officer when heading to Oscorp Tower, it seemed as if Spider-Man wasn't going to make it there. But when Jack's father saw him struggling on the news, he knew that he had to help. Spider-Man saved his son, and now it was time for him to return the favor. He called the crane operator and told him to line the cranes up so Spider-Man could swing across them to Oscorp. Although Spider-Man's suit doesn't have expressive mechanical eyes like Tom Holland's does, you can still tell what emotion Peter is feeling by his body language. When he briefly stares at the cranes getting into position, he's thinking, "Hey, they're actually helping me," That's very thoughtful of them. This was Spider-Man's only chance at getting to Oscorp before it was too late. It was risky, but he had no other options. The spotlight from the helicopter and the music both contributed to how dire the situation was. Spider-Man had a long distance to jump, and it was uncertain if he would make it, considering he had a gunshot wound in his leg. These elements put together, the soundtrack, the visuals, and Andrew Garfield's acting, they all come together and make an incredibly powerful scene. And the message of the scene was really well thought out too. Sometimes even the strongest of heroes need help. Again, I can't show you the entire scene, but I'll leave a link to it in the description. There are a couple of other scenes I thought were really good additions, those being Dr. Connors pulling Peter up after being defeated, and Uncle Ben's voice message to Peter. In the former, Dr. Connors saves Peter from falling off the building by grabbing him with his lizard arm, which was beginning to rot away. He could have let Peter die, but he made sure that didn't happen. Peter took away everything he ever wanted, so why would Dr. Connors save him? The answer is quite simple. The lizard was dead, and Dr. Connors was back to his normal self. He and Peter really cared about each other. Dr. Connors was a close friend of Peter's father and was a mentor to Peter as well. Since the lizard serum was no longer affecting him, he could make valid judgments again. He wouldn't want his protege to fall to his death, even after what he had done to him, so he went ahead and saved him. It shows how good of a person Dr. Connors was before he became the lizard, and the fact he was using the arm he was about to lose further shows how much Peter meant to him. Peter's life mattered more than his arm. And that's a similar case to the other scene I mentioned. In it, we get to hear the full voice message Uncle Ben sent to Peter shortly before he died. The film already showed us how close Peter and Uncle Ben were. Uncle Ben was like a father to Peter, and when he was murdered, Peter was devastated. The voice message he sent expressed even further how much he cared about him. He thought that even though Peter had done some questionable things, he was destined for good and that he still saw him as his son. Peter almost listens to the message earlier in the film, but because of how soon it had been since Uncle Ben's death, he felt like he couldn't take it yet. And I get that. I've lost family members who I deeply cared for as well. For a while, it's hard to look at photos and videos of them without breaking into tears. So I can understand why Peter chose not to listen to the message until the end of the movie. By then, enough time had passed that it wouldn't hurt as much to listen to. This scene, as well as the other scenes I've discussed, were all wonderfully executed, and I think they deserve a lot of praise for that. Now, even though this is my favorite Spider-Man film, I'll admit it isn't perfect. Aside from The Room, I don't think there is a perfect movie. So here are the things about The Amazing Spider-Man that I didn't like. Even though the lizard's design wasn't horrible, it definitely could have been better. I would have made him look more like an anthro by giving him a muzzle, which he had in the comics and animated shows. He should have worn the lab coat for a longer amount of time too. I also thought it was stupid of Peter to put his camera, which had his name on it, in the sewer. That made it way too easy for the lizard to figure out that he was Spider-Man. Peter also should have told Gwen outright that he couldn't see her anymore instead of ghosting her. As someone who's been ghosted by friends in the past, I think it's better to tell someone that you can't or won't talk to them anymore than to ghost them. When you're ghosted, you don't even know what you did wrong, so it would hurt even more than if you were told the reason. Inconclusiveness is worse than a bad ending, at least to me it is. Another problem with the film was that Peter wasn't very good at hiding his identity at times. The people who witnessed the fight on the subway would surely remember what Peter looked like and that he fought the same way that Spider-Man did. Denting that football upright was pretty suspicious as well, since no one without superhuman strength could do such a thing with one throw. Peter didn't hide his face when he did his first web swing or when he started searching for his uncle's killer, so the people who witnessed either of those things could have outed Peter as Spider-Man, but alas, nobody did. A third problem I had with the film was something I actually excused earlier. I think what they did with Peter choosing to stay with Gwen was fine, but it would have been better to have them separate until the next film. It didn't make much sense to have them break up early in the sequel just to make them get back together again later on. Ending the first film on a bittersweet note, with Peter and Gwen separating, would have been a much more impactful and emotional ending than the one we got. But I think the biggest problem this movie had was that many important scenes were cut. An alternate version of Uncle Ben's death was cut, and I'd argue it's better than the one they went with. That version had the great power comes great responsibility speech, but muffled and being said into a cell phone, which made it seem like it would have been the voice message Peter listened to at the end of the film. We didn't get a very good look at Uncle Ben's killer either, so it's likely we wouldn't know who it was until they revealed it in the next scene, and that would make us feel just as surprised and sorrowful as Peter. Multiple scenes featuring Dr. Connors were scrapped too, and those ones would have expanded on his character, like showing more of his relationship with Peter and that he has a family. There was an alternate version of Peter discovering the lizard's hideout as well. Instead of the lizard fleeing the school and leaving everything out in the sewer, including his plans for Oscorp and the lizard drug, he asked for Peter to help him and led him to the sewers, where he revealed his plans himself. We even got a conclusion to what happened to Rotha, who tracked the lizard down but ended up getting killed by him. The first-person scene that introduced Peter's suit was also shortened in the final cut, which sucked because the first-person scenes in the film were pretty damn awesome, and it would have been cool to see more of them. But even with these scenes deleted and those other problems kept in mind, the film is in no way bad. Far from it, actually. The Amazing Spider-Man's characters, writing, acting, visual elements, and action were all executed so well. I think people should let go of their biases toward Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland and give this movie a chance. It really doesn't deserve all the hate it gets. If you put aside the fact it's a reboot and pay attention to the elements I mentioned throughout this video, I'm sure you'll find the film much more enjoyable, and possibly even downright amazing.